How's it going, everybody? My name is Alex, and a little while ago, as you may know, I had a discussion with Stephen Woodford and Rachel Oates on Stephen's channel about veganism. Link is, of course, in the description. Now, for me, this was an exploratory conversation in which I didn't really have a solid stance and was aiming principally to just simply discuss some interesting philosophical questions raised by the issue of meat eating. Since then, I've been doing a bit of reading and a lot of thinking, and the more I do, the more my sympathy for the philosophy of veganism grows. I should state I'm still not a vegan, and perhaps that's because the debate in my mind has been almost purely philosophical rather than practical. But now, whenever I consider the future of my diet, I can't help but imagine that animal products will one day no longer be a component of it. Albert Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, wrote, "The principle can be established that for a man who does not cheat, what he believes to be true must determine his action." And it's in that vein that I realize that there can only be one of two outcomes for me. Either someone convinces me that the arguments I'm about to present are flawed, or at some point I'll just have to suck it up and join the growing trend of a herbivorous lifestyle. Now don't worry, my channel isn't turning into a veganism advocacy channel or anything, but I feel like the purpose of this channel is to discuss interesting philosophical topics, and this is one of the most important of them all. So I wanted to make a video presenting some, but certainly not all, of the arguments that are leading me to believe that every day of my life I commit an act so immoral that I can hardly bear to think about it, and see if any of you, by way of comment or response, can talk me out of it. It's something we haven't talked about on this channel before, and so even if you don't agree with these arguments, I hope you find it useful to hear them presented nonetheless. So, if you think that you can philosophically defend eating meat or factory farming, consider this a challenge. Believe me, I'd love to be convinced to agree with you, but I can't fool myself. We'll discuss reasons people commonly give to justify eating meat and try to see whether or not they're flawed. So, with a distant hope that someone out there can stop me from fully succumbing to them, I, a current meat eater, present some arguments for veganism. Just two things to note as a throat clearing. Firstly, this, unlike other videos like it, is a purely philosophical and moral video. You won't find statistics about global warming or footage of slaughterhouses here. It's all brain-based, armchair moral philosophy, if you will. Secondly, I'm not doing a video like this because I'm some kind of animal lover. I do love animals, it's true, but don't think that you need to feel this way yourself in order to justify veganism. Peter Singer points out in his seminal Animal Liberation that you don't need to see yourself as some kind of lover of black people to see that racism is wrong. I hope that we can view this morally and reasonably rather than purely emotionally. That's why I won't try to win you over with footage of animals being mistreated or things like that, though believe me, that does exist and it's effective. With that said, here goes. So speaking of Peter Singer, perhaps the most important animal ethicist of recent memory, I think the main philosophical takeaway from his book, which you should all definitely read by the way, I'll leave a link in the description, is this: that the boundary we've constructed between human beings and other animals is completely arbitrary and almost entirely unjustified. Here's a good quote. "In the popular mind, the term animal lumps together beings as different as oysters and chimpanzees, while placing a gulf between chimpanzees and humans, although our relationship to those apes is much closer than the oysters." It's a fair point. Why should we consider ourselves so different from other animals, and to the extent that they're ours to do with as we please? Here we deal with argument number one in favour of meat eating. Humans are superior to other animals because of X, and therefore we can eat them. Yeah, few problems with that. Firstly, by what metric are we superior? Perhaps the only feasible answer to this is something along the lines of intelligence. Clearly, human beings possess a higher cognitive ability than, say, a chicken. But my question is this: what relevance does that hold to morality? Why should intelligence be the metric by which we measure moral worth? It's arbitrary, it means nothing in itself. Should we morally value human beings with higher intelligence over other humans with lower intelligence? I think not. But even if you do, we surely shouldn't value them to the extent that they should be able to mistreat, kill, and eat the less intelligent humans just because they think they taste nice. Clearly, it's not intelligence alone that can justify this kind of practice. And again, why intelligence? Why not choose some other feature than intelligence, like, say, eyesight? Clearly, eagles have a far superior eyesight to humans, but does that give them any higher moral worth? Of course not. What is it about intelligence that its mere possession grants you a right to life and liberty that should be restricted from those who lack it? Nothing. It's a poor excuse. Now obviously, high intelligence is arguably more useful to humanity than good eyesight is, but we have to be careful to distinguish that we're not looking for how we can judge what is most useful, but rather how we can judge what has more moral worth. And this can't be linked to intelligence. Trying to find a quality that a being can possess to justify them treating other beings who don't have that quality differently is known to philosophers as naming the trait, or as I'm presenting it, the name the trait argument. Essentially, the argument is that it's not possible to find the trait that non-human animals supposedly lack, that if a human were to lack, we'd treat the human how we currently treat the animals. For instance, you say we kill the animals because they don't have trait X that humans do have. And the argument is, if we found a human being who themselves lacked X, would we be justified in killing them? If the answer is no, then we haven't actually identified the trait that justifies killing animals at all. You can put anything you like where X goes. You might say that we kill animals because they can't talk, for instance. The response is, if there's a human who can't talk, should we kill them? Of course not. Now, the ability to talk is, of course, not a common argument, but it illustrates the point. As an example, let's take the earlier and more common point of intelligence. The argument from the person naming the trait would be that we can treat animals as we please because they have less intelligence than we do. That's the trait. Not only is this not technically provable beyond necessarily biased metrics of intelligence, not only does it stink of so-called scientific racism, where the maltreatment of other races was justified by an appeal to their alleged lack of intelligence, but if we took a human being and turned them into the least intelligent human being you know of, would you flinch if I turned them upside down and slit their throat for food? Why? If the argument is that we can kill animals because they're less intelligent, then you're saying that it's merely lacking intelligence that justifies the taking of their life. If this doesn't apply to humans too, then there's something you're leaving out of your reasoning, because it's not just intelligence. And what is that something? Well, it's invariably the mere fact that humans are the same species as you are, and that non-human animals aren't. This, of course, has absolutely no moral relevance of its own accord, and it's just not a good enough reason to mistreat other living beings. It has the same ethical strength as appealing to the innate value of belonging to a certain race or gender. That is to say, it has no ethical strength. And I should stress that this applies for any quality you can think of. All I'm looking for here is philosophical consistency. If you said to me that actually, yes, you do think it's justifiable to kill human beings of lower intelligence for meat, I'd want to talk you out of it, of course, but I can absolutely see why you'd think the same thing about animals, and at least you'd be being consistent. But if you justify one and not the other, you've got a problem. And we certainly can't use morally arbitrary metrics like intelligence to justify the killing of either animals or humans. But okay, so what about something like emotional intelligence, you might say? Human beings are more sensitive to pain than other animals. They develop complex emotional fears and attachments, not to mention the fact that we care about each other. This distinguishes us from other animals. Other animals don't feel the same level of pain that we do. They don't fear their own death, and they certainly don't care about each other in the same way that we do. This is a second argument in favor of meat eating. This, if you ask me, doesn't work either. Firstly, on the point of pain, let me bring up something that made my stomach turn when I first thought about it. In fact, of all the small things that came together to make me start thinking about veganism seriously, this may have been the most grotesque to me. Think about the fact that, as we've already said, an eagle has a much stronger eyesight than humans do. Likewise, dogs are much more sensitive to smell than we are, such that we can't even imagine what it must be like to experience smell as vividly and acutely as they do. Does it not seem reasonable that, given that other animals are more sense-driven creatures than we are, their capacity to feel pain actually far exceeds our own, just as their capacities for eyesight or smell do? It seems rational to think that this may well be the case. I said a moment ago that intelligence is an arbitrary metric by which to judge moral worth. The ability to feel pain, however, is not. It's a matter of fact, definitionally in fact, that pain infringes on well-being. It's reasonable to consider well-being the goal of morality, even if it's just subjectively so. And so if you're going to make the argument that the possession of some superior quality makes one species superior to another, then it's quite possibly the animals that end up on your plate who have a higher claim to moral worth than you do, because the only possible quality that has any relevance here is the ability to feel pain, and they may well feel it more acutely than we do. Ability to feel pain, at the very least, is far more relevant to moral worth than intelligence is. It's worth mediating on the counsel of Jeremy Bentham, who famously wrote of animals, "The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Why should the law refuse its protection to any sensitive being?" Well, furthermore, even if it's true that non-human animals really do feel less pain than we do, that's still just not enough. Just because they feel less pain doesn't mean they feel no pain. We might say that if human beings have a pain receptivity of, say, 10, and non-human animals have a pain receptivity of 0, then we can justify the humans killing the animals. But we can't say the same if the animals have a pain receptivity of, say, 7. They're still suffering, even if not to the same extent that humans would be if we treated them the same way. This would be like justifying a small genocide on the grounds that it's not as bad as the Holocaust was. It's still bad, and it's still unjustifiable. Okay, let's move on to something else. This might seem like an odd direction to move in, but I want to introduce you to, or remind you of, the political philosophy of John Rawls. John Rawls was an American liberal philosopher who Bill Clinton once described as, quote, perhaps the greatest political philosopher of the 20th century. In his famous theory of justice, Rawls presented a thought experiment that we could use to determine how best to organize society. Rawls asked us to imagine ourselves in an original position, as he put it, behind a veil of ignorance. You're about to enter society, but from this original position behind the veil, you don't know yet whether you'll be black or white, male, female, rich or poor. You don't know anything about what social characteristics you'll have when you enter this society. It's from this original position, Rawls argues, that we'd be best placed to design society because we design the most just system without biasing it towards our own group. Essentially, we should organize society as if we didn't know who we were going to be within it, to ensure that we're designing it fairly. This thought experiment has been much repeated and much applauded because it's reasonable. Surely the fairest way to design society is from a point of impartiality. Well, let's see if you figured out where this is going. I was discussing Rawls with Stephen Woodford recently, and we're both of the opinion that Rawls's thought experiment should not just apply to human beings. So here's my version of the thought experiment. This will probably sound really weird at first, but bear with me. Imagine the same situation. You're about to enter the world and you're currently behind the veil of ignorance in the original position. But it's not that you're about to enter the world as a human being, as Rawls had it. Instead, you're about to enter the world as a thing. As in, you could be any object in the world and you have no idea what you're going to be. So not only could you be white or black or rich or poor, you could be a brick, or a tree, or a mobile phone, or a pig, or a cow, or a human being. You could be anything, you have no way to know. Okay, so now, design society. It's worth noting that, philosophically speaking, the particles that construct your being really could have gone to anything else in the universe just as easily, so this isn't trivial. But consider the following. Knowing that you could be a brick in this original position wouldn't make you want to prevent bricks from being used in construction. If you were a brick, you wouldn't know you're a brick, and you wouldn't feel any pain. You wouldn't feel anything. It shouldn't bother you at all. You wouldn't mind being a chair, because you're not sentient, so who cares if people are sitting on you? But would you mind being a chicken? Would you mind being a factory-farmed chicken? Of course you would. And if you were really in this original position, you would abolish the meat industry immediately. Bear in mind, you could still enter the world as a human and benefit from the meat industry. You simply don't know who you're going to be. And if you were a chicken, you'd have the same intelligence and self-awareness as any other chicken has now. But are you willing to take that risk? Chickens outnumber, I'll remind you, humans 3-to-1, so you've got 3 times as much chance of entering the world as a chicken. Nobody in their right mind from this position would design a society that permits the meat industry as it exists today. Think of all the arguments you've ever heard in favor of meat eating, about humans being superior or worth more, or how some people need meat for strength, etc. Would any of these even tempt you to allow the meat industry because you know that if you were born as a chicken, then your suffering would be worth their pleasure since they're superior beings as humans? It certainly wouldn't tempt me. So what are we doing here? I'll leave it to your consideration. On to the next point, and this is about equality between humans and animals. Surely, you might argue, it's ridiculous to try to draw such an equality between humans and animals. There are quite easily detectable differences, both physically and cognitively, between them. So let's take a look at this claim. Firstly, it pays to remember that we are animals, not a distinct form of being. But secondly, and here's the more important point, I might just as easily say something like it's foolish to draw an equality between black people and white people because there are clearly identifiable physical and cultural differences between them. But this would completely miss the point. We don't condemn racism because all races are equal. They're not. They look different, they have different proportions, skin colours and eye shapes, and different cultures and different histories, different religions, different biology, and some data even suggests different IQ averages. But the whole point of racial justice is not to deny these differences, but to point out that these differences are completely irrelevant to determining whether or not someone deserves life and freedom. It's not about saying that there are no differences between us, but that despite our differences, we all have an equal moral worth. The same applies to differences in gender and social class, and arguably, species. In other words, to answer the claim that it's ridiculous to see animals and humans as equals, you don't have to in order to recognize that they both have moral worth. But you don't even have to think that human beings and non-human animals do have an equal moral worth in order to justify veganism. There are many ways in which we might determine a human being to have more moral worth than a non-human animal. For instance, human beings have an awareness of the future that most animals lack. If we were killing humans for food, it would just cause pandemonium amongst all of us, but this wouldn't happen with, say, chickens, who don't know what's going to happen to them. Now, this is a relevant difference in the sense that if we have to have an industry that converts living beings into meat, it makes far more moral sense to do this to chickens than to humans because of this difference. However, this presupposes that we do need such an industry at all, which is simply not the case. It might be more moral to kill chickens for food than to kill humans for food, but that doesn't make it actually moral to do either of these. It's more moral to just murder someone than to rape and murder them, but neither of these is moral. So even if we do see animals as having less moral worth than humans, this doesn't justify us treating them as though they have no moral worth at all. But this is an interesting consideration. Should we consider the life of a pig as equally morally valuable to the life of a human? Well, no. At least you don't have to. I can't count the number of times I've heard someone say to vegans something along the lines of, well, if you were on a desert island with a pig and a human being and you were about to starve, which one would you kill and eat? You'd kill the pig? See, pigs are worth less than humans. Okay, let's just think about these kinds of comments for a minute. I'll ask you another question. If you were on a desert island with two humans, one elderly, frail and disabled, the other youthful, intelligent, talented and promising, and you were about to starve, which person would you eat? I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that you should kill the elderly person if you have to kill one of them. But here's the thing. You don't have to kill either. That's just not the situation we're in. Just because you'd rather kill the elderly person than the youthful one because you think they have less moral worth, doesn't justify us setting up a meat industry in the real world where we kill and eat the elderly, even if they are genuinely worth less morally. You can easily see a human as more valuable than a pig, but this alone doesn't justify killing and eating the pig. I'll put it another way. Believe me, if I had to make this decision, I would not have a hard time choosing whether to save a drowning sheep or a drowning human baby. But as I say, that's just not the situation we're in. It's more like choosing between saving a drowning sheep or giving a human child a piece of chocolate that it will enjoy. Which would you choose to do? Save the sheep or give the child the chocolate? I know what I'd do. I'd save the sheep. And I wouldn't save the sheep because I value the sheep more than I do the human. I'd save the sheep because I value its life over a transient moment of sensory pleasure for the human. It's not about whether we value animals as much as humans. It's about whether we value animals as much as human taste buds. And in a world where human taste buds can be just as easily appeased by plant-based alternatives as they can by meat. We no longer live in a world that requires meat consumption to sustain even our health, let alone our lives. We can get by easily without meat. I mean, really, do you really think that the reason people still eat meat is because they just need it to survive? Of course not. It's because it tastes nice. That's it. So this whole discussion surrounding whether or not animals are of equal worth to human beings is a red herring, because the real contrast isn't between the life of animals and the life of humans, it's between the life of animals and the taste buds of humans. Now, however much less you could possibly value the life and well-being of an animal to the life and well-being of a human, and perhaps justifiably so, there's simply no excuse for claiming that its value is less than something so trivial as our taste buds. Now, you might claim that there's more to it than that. You might say, for instance, that bodybuilders need meat to sustain their strength. In that case, even if this is true, the question simply becomes, what do we value more, sentient life or bodybuilding? I'll leave that with you, but just as it may be true that, say, steroids can really improve a person's physical strength, and yet competitions still ban them, we can admit that eating meat might really improve a person's strength, and yet still not condone it, because it's simply not worth it. So, to conclude, even if we are superior to other animals in terms of intelligence or capacity for pain or whatever it may be, even if we're not equal, even if we don't have the same moral worth, the meat industry is still morally bankrupt. Clearly, our tastes shouldn't be discounted entirely. There are many things in the world with less moral worth than our taste buds, but the life and suffering of factory-farmed sentient beings is not one of them. Show me the quality that these beings lack, that if a human lacked, we'd shove such humans into tiny cages and grow them so fat that they're crippled by their own weight, and forcibly impregnate them and remove the subsequent child and sell the mother to a slaughterhouse, and you might have the ghost of a justification for eating meat. Besides that, I just don't see it. But if you do think that there is some way to morally distinguish farm animals from human beings, not to mention distinguishing them, by the way, from other species that we consider it immoral to mistreat, like dogs, and in such a way that we can justifiably kill them for meat, then please, for goodness sake, let me know. I'm a sucker for meat. I love it, and I'm genuinely hoping that someone out there can convince me that I'm justified in eating it. Don't think that I'm blind to the attraction of bacon or steak, but also don't pretend yourself to be blind to the incalculable suffering that was necessary to get these things onto your plate. Ask yourself, is it worth it? In 1973, Ursula Le Guin published a short story called The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. In the story, Omelas is the perfect city of pleasure, a kind of utopia, in which everyone is joyful and free of pain. But there's a child, a deformed child who's suffering, neglected and starving and in immense pain in a broom cupboard beneath the buildings of the city. And through some technology that's not quite explained, it's this child's immense suffering that sustains the pleasures of Omelas. People sometimes visit the child out of pity or just morbid curiosity, but they're not allowed to show him affection or offer help. Some people, after seeing what it is that's happening in that broom cupboard, simply and quietly pack their bags and leave the city. Take a few minutes to read that short story, the link is in the description, and ask yourself honestly if you'd be one of the noble souls who head for the mountains, or if you'd push that suffering that you now know to be happening right under your nose to the back of your mind so that you can continue to enjoy your trivial sensory pleasures. It might just be the most important moral question of our time. I've been Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic, and I want to remind you that these videos are produced entirely thanks to your support on Patreon. So to all my patrons, thank you. You're the reason that I can do this. Be sure to follow me on social media, especially Twitter. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.